She tried to evict me from my own ranch, not knowing I'm the man who governs every HOA in the nation. The morning sun glowed across the rolling acres of Silverstone Ranch. Mark Callan was fixing the fence when he saw a white SUV crawl up the dirt road, spotless, shiny, and very out of place. Out stepped a woman in heels and sunglasses, clutching a clipboard like it was a weapon. "Good morning," she said sharply. "I'm Corinne Fletcher, president of the Willow Creek Homeowners Association. We need to talk about your violations." Mark wiped his hands on his jeans, squinting. "Violations? This is a ranch. I don't even live inside your HOA boundary." Corinne smiled, cold and confident. "Oh, you do now. The county just expanded our jurisdiction, and according to Section 4C, your barn color is not approved." Mark's eyes narrowed. Something told him this wasn't just a visit, it was a declaration of war. By afternoon, the sun blazed high above the quiet suburban hills, and Mark's ranch, once the peaceful outlier of the neighborhood, had become the center of attention. Corinne stood at his front gate in her pastel cardigan and oversized sunglasses, armed with a clipboard and righteous fury. The metal clang of her stapler echoed as she taped a bright yellow notice to the gate. The letters were bold and threatening. "Final warning. Noncompliance will result in eviction and daily fines." Her handwriting was sharp and deliberate, each letter an accusation. The list of supposed violations stretched nearly a page long. Unauthorized livestock, referring to the 3 horses Mark had owned for years before the HOA was even formed. Non-regulation fencing. His old wooden fence, hand-built by his father, didn't match the new neighborhood color palette. Visual disruption of aesthetic harmony. Apparently, his ranch-style home clashed with the modern gray boxes surrounding it. She even cited grass inconsistency, claiming that a single dry patch disrupted the community's image. Neighbors began to gather in small clusters, pretending to check their mail or water plants as they watched the drama unfold. Some whispered nervously, afraid of being the next on Corinne's list. Others rolled their eyes, muttering that she'd finally lost it. But Corinne didn't care. She thrived on the spotlight, the smell of fear, the sound of her own authority echoing through cul-de-sacs. Power was her morning coffee and nightly lullaby. Her favorite phrase, the one she'd recite like a prayer, carried through the breeze. "Rules are rules." When Mark arrived home, the scene was already buzzing. He stopped by the gate, studying the notice for a long, quiet moment. His weathered hands traced the bold letters, his reflection shimmering faintly in the metal. Then, without a word, he reached into his pocket, pulled out a black pen, and signed his name just beneath hers. Not in protest, not in anger, but with intention. He looked up at Corinne, who was still standing a few houses away, clipboard in hand, surveying her kingdom. Their eyes met for a brief second, hers full of smug certainty, his calm unreadable. Then he turned and walked back inside. Behind the calm smile, something had shifted. Corinne believed she had authority. What she didn't know was that Mark had written the very foundation of that authority, the federal charter that governed every HOA in the country. And this time, he wasn't going to just fight back. He was going to teach her what rules really meant. The morning air carried the faint scent of rain as Mark guided his old pickup down the winding highway into town. The engine rumbled steadily beneath him, a familiar sound that always seemed to quiet his thoughts. Dust still clung to his boots and jeans, but he didn't bother brushing it off. He wasn't going to a ranchers' meeting today. He was going to reclaim something far greater. At the edge of the business district stood a tall, glass building, with a modest plaque near the entrance. National Housing Oversight Authority. To most passers-by, it was just another faceless government office. But behind those mirrored windows lay the heartbeat of every homeowners association in the country, the system that decided how millions of people lived, what they built, and what they owed. Mark parked his truck beside a line of sleek black sedans. He took a moment before stepping out, his eyes scanning the reflection of the city skyline in the glass doors. Then, tipping his dusty hat forward, he walked in. Inside, heads turned, conversations hushed. The receptionist, a young woman in a navy blazer, immediately stood up. "Good morning, Director Callan," she said warmly, her tone shifting to respectful alertness. He gave a small nod and removed his hat. "Morning." He wasn't just another bureaucrat. He was the architect of the NHOA, the one who designed its entire regulatory framework decades ago, long before anyone called him Mark the Rancher. To most of the world, he'd stepped down from public service years ago. Only a handful of senior officials knew the truth. He still held executive authority under the national charter. He made his way through the quiet halls, the rhythmic sound of his boots echoing off the marble floor. A few employees nodded as he passed, whispering in his wake. The plaque on the executive wing still read, "Director M. Callan, Federal Oversight Division." His assistant, Nora Briggs, a sharp woman in her 50s with a mind like steel, was already waiting by his office door, holding a tablet. "Morning, sir," she said, walking in step with him. "I take it this visit isn't social." "Not today," he replied. "We've got a problem out in Willow Creek." Nora raised an eyebrow. "That's one of the new suburban expansions, right? HOA-heavy district." "Too heavy," Mark muttered, setting his hat on the desk. "Seems their president's been issuing illegal fines, threatening eviction, even posting public notices without state validation." "Typical," Nora said dryly. "We've seen worse." Mark turned toward the window, gazing down at the city below. "This one's different." "How so?" He looked over his shoulder, eyes steady. "Because she tried evicting me." The words hung in the air for a long moment. Nora blinked, unsure whether she'd heard correctly. "You mean Karen Mitchell?" He nodded once. A slow smile curved across Nora's face. "Oh, this is going to be interesting." Mark sat down at his desk, sliding open a drawer. Inside was a small brass key, worn but still gleaming. He inserted it into a locked compartment built beneath the desktop and turned it. The drawer opened with a soft click, revealing a stack of stamped documents bound in leather. The official seal of the NHOA shone faintly under the light. He took one file, labeled Regional Oversight, Willow Creek HOA, and placed it on the desk. "Let's open a new case file," he said calmly. "Subject, Willow Creek Homeowners Association, potential abuse of power." Nora nodded, already typing. "Do you want to issue a standard compliance review?" "No," Mark said, his tone low and deliberate. "I want a full audit. Financials, leadership conduct, fine issuance records, property claims, everything." He paused, leaning back in his chair. "And I want it quiet, no local alerts." Nora glanced up. "Understood. You want them to hang themselves first." "Exactly." As she left to begin the investigation, Mark opened the folder and signed the first page, not as Mark Callan, resident of Willow Creek, but as Director M. Callan, national chairman of the NHOA. His pen glided across the line, his initials sealing the order. A faint smile tugged at the corner of his lips. The signature was invisible to the world, buried under layers of bureaucracy. But for those who knew where to look, it was the signature that could end entire organizations. And for Karen Mitchell, it would mark the beginning of her downfall. A week passed in uneasy silence. The neighborhood had gone strangely quiet, as if the entire community could sense a storm building. Even Karen, usually seen patrolling the streets like a self-appointed sheriff, had been staying indoors more often, though her blinds twitched every few minutes, revealing the faintest flicker of paranoia behind them. Then one morning, a letter arrived. It was thick, official, and sealed with the emblem of the National Housing Oversight Authority, NHOA. a golden crest embossed with the outline of a house surrounded by laurel leaves. Karen scoffed. "Government junk mail," she muttered, tossing it on the counter with a pile of catalogs and HOA newsletters. But something about the weight of the envelope caught her attention. The seal shimmered slightly under the light, real wax, not the printed kind. Curiosity overcame her arrogance. She tore it open. Inside was a neatly folded document printed on heavy ivory paper. Her eyes skimmed the heading. Notice of Federal Oversight Review, Willow Creek Homeowners Association. Pursuant to Section 42A of the National Housing Ethics Act. Her heart began to pound. She kept reading until her eyes froze at the signature line. Director Mark Callan. For a split second, her mind refused to connect the dots. Then it hit her like a hammer to glass. Mark Callan. The same Mark she'd fined for unauthorized livestock. The same man she'd publicly threatened with eviction. The quiet rancher with the worn hat and calm smile. Her hands trembled, the paper slipping from her fingers. Oh no," she whispered. Her reflection in the kitchen window looked pale and ghost-like. For the first time in her reign of suburban tyranny, fear crept into her perfect posture. Within an hour, she had her phone out, her voice trembling as she sent rapid texts to the HOA board members. "Emergency meeting, now. We have a situation." By sunset, the community clubhouse was lit up like a courtroom. The board gathered around a long, polished table, 7 members, all wearing the same nervous expressions. Karen stood at the head, clutching her clipboard like a shield. "Everyone listen," she began, forcing composure. "It's come to my attention that we've received an inquiry from the NHOA." One of the board members, Denise, frowned. "The national authority, what for?" "Apparently," Karen said tightly, "someone filed a report about abuse of power. Which is ridiculous, of course. We just need to make sure our documentation is." A knock interrupted her. The room fell silent. Karen's assistant, a timid woman named Lacey, opened the door and stepped in, holding a sleek black device. "Ma'am, they told me to set this up for the audit call," she said nervously. "Who told you that?" Karen snapped. The NHOA representative." The board exchanged worried glances. Karen's throat went dry. Lacey placed the small recorder-like device on the table and pressed a button. A soft blue light blinked to life. Then, a calm, authoritative voice came through the speaker. "Good evening, members of the Willow Creek Homeowners Association. This is the National Housing Oversight Authority conducting a preliminary audit. Please be advised, this session is being recorded." Karen froze. "We'll begin with standard questions regarding financial allocations, fines, and leadership procedures. Please answer truthfully. Non-disclosure or misrepresentation will result in federal suspension of local authority." Every board member turned toward her. Sweat formed along her temples. "Wasn't informed of this audit," she stammered. "We haven't had time to prepare." "Preparation isn't required," the voice replied smoothly. "Transparency is." A pause followed. Then almost casually the speaker added, "Director Callan sends his regards." The color drained completely from Karen's face. The air left the room. Behind her calm smile, Mark's plan had already unfolded, weeks in motion, quiet and surgical. Every word, every fine, every misuse of power she had committed was being logged and analyzed in real time. Karen straightened, forcing herself to regain control. "Fine," she said tightly, her voice brittle. "Let's proceed." But deep down she already knew this wasn't a meeting. It was her trial. And the boardroom, once her kingdom, had become her cage. The boardroom felt different that night, colder, heavier. The once pristine walls of the Willow Creek Community Center, usually bright and echoing with polite chatter, now seemed to press inward like silent witnesses. Karen stood at the head of the long oak table, her posture rigid but her face pale. Beads of sweat gathered at her temples, betraying the panic beneath her forced smile. Each board member sat in uneasy silence, clutching their folders like lifelines. In front of each of them lay a letter embossed with the golden seal of the National Housing Oversight Authority, a confidential summons. They hadn't been called by Corinne. They'd been summoned by someone far above her reach. The ticking of the wall clock was the only sound in the room. 6:59 p.m. 1 minute until the scheduled meeting. Then the door opened. Mark Callan stepped in quietly, wearing the same old rancher's jacket and dust-coated boots. He looked out of place among the polished shoes and manicured appearances, yet somehow his presence commanded the entire room. He gave a polite nod to the members. "Good evening." Corinne stiffened, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Mr. Callan, I didn't realize you'd be attending personally." Mark set a heavy leather briefcase on the table and replied, "Oh, you'll find I take personal interest in cases that bear my name." He opened the briefcase with deliberate calm, producing a thick file stamped Willow Creek HOA, Ethical Review, Level 1 Priority. Without preamble, he began reading. His voice was steady, unhurried, the kind of calm that made every word hit harder. Unauthorized issuance of fines totaling 47300. Failure to record HOA expenditures for fiscal quarters 2 through 4. Manipulation of election ballots and denial of candidacy to eligible members. Illegal property seizures disguised as lien enforcements. Each accusation landed like a hammer. Mark flipped a page. "All these signed under your name, Ms. Mitchell." Corinne's voice trembled. "This is absurd. Those were legitimate actions under community authority. I was maintaining order." Mark looked up, eyes sharp but unreadable. Order or control? A murmur spread across the table. Denise, the treasurer, glanced nervously at the others. "Corinne, you told us the fines were pre-approved by the state." Corinne's composure began to crack. "They were. I had every right." Mark raised a hand, silencing her instantly. His tone was firm but never loud. "Actually, you didn't. You fall directly under federal jurisdiction, my jurisdiction. The NHOA code you claim to follow, I wrote it." A heavy silence filled the room. The color drained from Corinne's face as the truth sank in. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't a warning. It was Judgment Day, and the man she'd mocked as a ranch nobody was the one writing the verdict. Mark continued, sliding a document toward her. "This is your official suspension notice. Effective immediately, you are relieved of all duties as HOA president pending federal review." Corinne's lips trembled. "You can't just come in here and—" Mark's gaze hardened. "I can, Ms. Mitchell, because I am the authority you answer to." No one spoke. The only sound was the soft hum of the ceiling fan. Then one by one the board members pushed back their chairs and stood not in protest but in silent acknowledgement. Denise stepped forward first, gently placing her HOA badge on the table. "I'm done," she said quietly. "We followed her lead because we trusted her. We didn't know." Others followed, setting down their papers, their pens, their symbols of control. The power that Corinne had once wielded so proudly now crumbled right before her eyes. Mark closed the file and stood. "The audit report will continue, but as of tonight, Willow Creek is under direct federal supervision. A temporary committee will manage operations until ethical compliance is restored." He reached for his hat, turned toward the door, and paused just long enough to say, "You wanted to enforce rules, Ms. Mitchell. Consider this your first lesson in what they actually mean." Then he left, calm, composed, and utterly final. Corinne remained standing, shaking, surrounded by the silence of those who once feared her. And for the first time since the HOA began, the neighborhood outside was truly free. Morning came quietly to Willow Creek, But peace didn't follow. By dawn, the story had already broken nationwide. It started with one article, a small piece published by a local journalist in the Medellite Chronicle. Local HOA president under federal investigation for fraud. It would have stayed a local scandal, one more story buried in the middle of the paper, if not for the name at the bottom of the federal notice. Director Mark Callan, National Housing Oversight Authority. Within hours, the story was everywhere. HOA corruption ring exposed. National Director personally investigates local president. From rancher to regulator, the secret life of America's HOA chief. The man who wrote the rules just enforced them on his own board. Television anchors repeated the headlines on loop. News vans crowded the entrance to Willow Creek. Their satellite dishes pointed skyward like metallic flowers. The community that once bragged about its perfect lawns and symmetry now found itself surrounded by flashing cameras and murmuring reporters. Corinne's mansion-like home at the end of Maple Ridge Drive became ground zero. Neighbors peeked through their blinds as news crews lined the street. Every few minutes, another journalist tried knocking on her door. No one answered. Meanwhile, Mark sat in his NHOA office, calm, collected, and silent. The blinds were half-drawn, sunlight slanting across the floor in perfect lines. On his desk lay stacks of files, not just for Willow Creek, but for dozens of HOAs across the nation. Each one marked with red flags: unlawful fines, election tampering, intimidation reports, misused funds. He didn't need to say much to the press. His silence said everything. The official statement released by the NHOA was only 4 sentences long. Following confirmed violations within the Willow Creek Homeowners Association, Director Mark Callan has initiated a national compliance review. Our mission remains unchanged: to ensure every community serves its residents, not its rulers. Effective immediately, federal audits have been ordered across all regional HOAs. No one is above the code. Within 48 hours, the statement went viral. Homeowners from every corner of the country, from gated communities in California to retirement parks in Florida, began sharing their own stories. Fines for mailbox colors, citations for garden ornaments, notices for lawn shade inconsistency. Now, for the first time, people weren't whispering their frustrations. They were speaking out. Mark watched as social media flooded with posts. Reclaim your home. No more Karen laws. Callan reform. He wasn't the type to revel in publicity, but this was impact. For years, HOAs had acted like miniature kingdoms, run by self-appointed tyrants under the illusion of order. He'd written the national charter to protect fairness, not to empower greed. Somewhere along the way, people like Corinne had turned it into a weapon. Now that weapon was being dismantled, piece by piece. Corinne, meanwhile, was unraveling. Her once flawless image, the confident, commanding HOA president, was now plastered on every news outlet in the country. Reporters dug through her record, uncovering a trail of questionable expenses, rigged elections, and personal gain masked as community enhancement. Her voice, once firm and untouchable, now shook when she spoke to her lawyer. "They can't do this," she hissed, packing her living room, blinds drawn. "I was just enforcing order. I didn't do anything illegal." Her attorney, a weary man named Carl Denton, sighed. "Corinne, you signed financial authorizations for personal reimbursements under false categories, community daycare, landscaping, even security patrols that didn't exist." Corinne froze. It's semantics, technicalities. Carl removed his glasses. "It's fraud, Corinne, and the director of the NHOA has the evidence himself." Her mind raced. "We can appeal, I can talk to him." Carl cut her off. "Mark Callan doesn't take calls, especially not from defendants under federal review." She slumped into her chair, her manicured nails digging into the armrest. Outside, cameras flashed against her curtains. For the first time, Karen realized what she'd become, not the enforcer of rules, but the example of what happens when rules are abused. 2 days later, Mark arrived in Washington, D.C., for a congressional briefing. The hearing room buzzed with anticipation. Lawmakers, journalists, and homeowners' rights advocates filled the seats. At the front, a long table awaited him, flanked by microphones and cameras. "Director Callan," began the chairwoman of the Housing Committee, "thank you for appearing on such short notice. Your actions in the Willow Creek case have sparked national reform. Can you explain the scale of the problem?" Mark adjusted the microphone. "Yes, ma'am," he said simply. His voice was calm, measured the same tone that once silenced entire boardrooms. For years, the HOA system has operated under the illusion of local control, with minimal oversight. What began as neighborhood cooperation evolved into abuse, unchecked power, financial exploitation, intimidation tactics. The case in Willow Creek is not an exception. It's the pattern. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the room. Cameras clicked like clockwork. Mark continued, sliding a thick binder forward. "These are preliminary findings from national audits. Over 62% of reviewed HOAs have shown evidence of ethical violations. Homeowners have been fined illegally, elections manipulated, and dissent silenced. The system has forgotten its purpose." The chairwoman leaned forward. "And what purpose should it serve?" Mark met her gaze steadily. "Community, not control." Applause broke out, quiet at first, then rising as more people stood. It wasn't loud or political. It was human. That night, news stations ran the footage on repeat. Talk shows debated his reform plan. Editorials called it the Callan Doctrine. The NHOA headquarters received thousands of letters. Not complaints this time, but thank yous. Veterans, retirees, young families, people who'd lost homes or peace of mind because of tyrannical HOAs, finally saw justice stirring. Mark didn't celebrate. He sat in his office long after the building emptied, staring out at the city lights. Reform wasn't victory, it was responsibility. He opened one of the files from the national audit. Inside were photos, children playing freely on a lawn that had once been forbidden because of noise ordinances. A couple repainting their porch in bright colors, no longer dictated by a rule book. Small freedoms, but they mattered. Nora, his assistant, stepped in quietly. "Sir, the federal press wants a statement for the evening broadcast. Something uplifting, hopeful." Mark smiled faintly. "Tell them this," he said. "Power should never live in fear of sunlight. Every community deserves fairness, not fear." Nora nodded, and Karen Mitchell. He closed the file. "Her case goes to court next month. Let the law handle the rest." The following week, Karen appeared before a federal judge in a marble courthouse in downtown Sacramento. Cameras swarmed the steps, reporters calling her name, but she kept her head down. Gone were the sunglasses, the polished hair, the confident smirk. Inside, as the charges were read, fraud, abuse of authority, falsification of public records, she barely listened. Her mind drifted back to that day by the ranch gate, the yellow notice she'd taped with such pride. "Rules are rules," she had said. Now she finally understood what that meant. Across the country, HOAs began rewriting their bylaws under new NHOA supervision. Elections were monitored. Fines required justification. Transparency became law. And for the first time in decades, homeowners held real power again. At the heart of it all was one man, the quiet rancher who had written the rules, vanished into the countryside, and returned only when it mattered most. Mark Callan's legend grew not because of his authority, but because of his restraint. He reminded the nation that systems don't fail because of paperwork. They fail because of people who forget the purpose behind it. As evening fell, Mark returned to his ranch. The sun dipped low behind the hills, painting the horizon in deep orange and gold. His horses grazed quietly near the old wooden fence, the same one Karen once tried to fine him for. He placed his hand on the post, feeling the rough grain of the wood, and smiled. No cameras, no headlines, just peace. The world would go on debating reforms, laws, and policies. But here, on his own land, the rules were simple again. The wind moved softly through the fields, carrying the distant sound of laughter, children playing somewhere beyond the hills. For Mark, that sound was enough. Because power wasn't meant to be feared. It was meant to protect. And finally it did. The empire of rules and paper that Karen Mitchell built, the empire she ruled with polished smiles and iron authority, fell faster than she ever imagined. It began quietly, not with a bang but with a letter. Notice of Asset Freeze, Federal Case 4317 NHOA. It arrived on a Thursday morning, sealed and formal, stamped with the same gold crest that once made her feel powerful. Only now, it was her undoing. Within hours, her bank accounts were locked, every line of credit she owned frozen. The luxury SUV she'd leased through community funds was repossessed before sunset. Even the marble-tiled home she decorated with HOA money, the symbol of her dominance, was marked for federal seizure. The same clipboard she had once used to dictate the lives of others now felt weightless in her trembling hands. For years, Karen had been the queen of uniformity, the enforcer of beige fences, approved mailbox dimensions, and the holy color palette of suburban harmony. Her rules shaped lawns, crushed defiance, and silenced dissent. She believed power came from order. But order without empathy is tyranny, and her kingdom was built on sand. The walls around her house, once spotless and precise, now echoed with the emptiness of a place no longer respected. Reporters still hovered, but their interest was no longer fascination, it was pity. Neighbors who once nodded obediently at her morning patrols now walked past her gate without acknowledgement. Some avoided her eyes entirely. Others looked at her the way one looks at a fallen monument, with disbelief and quiet satisfaction. For the first time in years, Karen was invisible. Her lawyer, Carl Denton, came to deliver the final blow. He sat across from her in the barren living room, stacks of legal documents spread across the dining table where she once hosted mandatory HOA dinners. "Karen," he said carefully, "the federal restitution order is non-negotiable. The assets seized will cover part of the damages. You'll need to appear in court again for sentencing." She rubbed her temples, staring at the faded sunlight on her walls. "How much is left?" Carl hesitated. "Personally, none." She looked up, her eyes hollow. "You mean I'm broke?" He nodded. "In every legal sense, yes." She gave a bitter laugh, the kind that sounds more like breaking glass. "I made this community. I gave them order, beauty, discipline. And now they're free," Carl interrupted softly, "and they don't need you anymore." She turned away, her jaw tight. "They'll regret it, they always do. Someone has to lead." Carl gathered his papers, slipping them into his briefcase. "Someone will," he said, standing, "but not like you." When he left, the silence was suffocating. The house creaked under the weight of its emptiness. For the first time, Karen realized she had never built a home, only an empire of fear. And now, even fear had abandoned her. Days turned into weeks. The auction notice went up. Her personal belongings, the pearl necklace, the framed certificates, even the silver pen she used to sign citations, were boxed and tagged. The clipboard remained, sitting on the counter like a relic of lost power. She stared at it often, tracing the scratches on its metal clip. It had once felt like a scepter. Now it was just plastic and rust. That was when she decided to see him, the man who had undone her. The drive to Mark's ranch was long and dusty. The sky stretched wide and merciless above her. She'd memorized the address from the audit files she once tried to destroy. Every mile closer made her heart heavier. When she finally reached the wooden gate, she froze. The sign that once read "Private Property" had been replaced with a simple one. Willow Creek Ranch, S. 1968. The gate was open. Horses grazed lazily in the pasture. Wind carried the scent of grass and soil, the kind of freedom she'd never noticed before. She spotted him near the barn, repairing a section of the fence, his hands steady, movements deliberate. He looked exactly as she remembered: worn hat, weathered boots, and eyes that saw more than he ever said. For a moment, Corinne almost turned back, but pride, the only thing she had left, forced her forward. "Mark," she called, her voice cracked more from shame than dust. He turned slowly, squinting against the light. "Ms. Mitchell." She stopped a few steps away, clutching her clipboard to her chest like a shield. "I wanted to see you," she began, "to tell you you've ruined everything I built." Mark leaned against the fence post, crossing his arms. "I didn't ruin anything. I just showed everyone what was already broken." Her jaw trembled. "You could have warned me. You could have told me who you were." "I did," he said quietly. "The first time you handed me that violation notice, I told you I wrote the rules." She faltered. "You tricked me." "No," he said, his voice firm but not cruel. "You tricked yourself. You thought power meant control. It doesn't." She swallowed hard, her eyes glistening. "Then what does it mean?" Mark looked past her, toward the open fields, the wind moving through tall grass, the horizon untouched by fences or signs. "Power," he said slowly, "is responsibility. It's knowing when to act and when to step back. You forgot that." Corinne lowered her head. The clipboard slipped from her fingers, clattering against the dirt. The sound seemed to echo louder than it should have. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Mark bent down, picked up the clipboard, and held it out to her. She hesitated, but he didn't let go immediately. "Keep it," he said. "A reminder, not of authority, but of what happens when you lose sight of why you had it." She took it silently, clutching it to her chest. The air between them was heavy with things that didn't need to be said: regret, shame, and perhaps a faint, unspoken understanding. Mark stepped back toward the barn. "Take care, Ms. Mitchell." Corinne turned, walking slowly toward her car. The gravel crunched under her heels. When she reached the gate, she stopped and looked back. Mark had already gone back to his work, mending the fence, one board at a time. He didn't watch her leave. He didn't need to. The past was gone, and the lesson had been learned, the hardest way possible. That evening, as the sun dipped below the hills, Corinne sat in her car at the edge of town, watching the ranch disappear in the rearview mirror. For the first time in her life, there was no plan, no list, no meeting to lead, just silence. She looked down at the clipboard beside her on the seat. The plastic was cracked now, the metal clip slightly bent. She turned it over and noticed something she'd never seen before: faint letters scratched into the back. It read, "Serve, don't rule." She didn't know if Mark had carved it or if it was just a trick of the light, but the words stayed with her. The next morning she left Willow Creek. No one saw her go. The house was sold, the locks changed, the sign removed. By the time the new residents moved in, the name Corinne Mitchell was just a whisper, a cautionary tale told with nervous laughter at neighborhood barbecues. Weeks later, in a quiet suburban park hundreds of miles away, a small community meeting was taking place. A few volunteers gathered around a folding table, discussing cleanup schedules and local improvements. At the edge of the group stood a woman in a plain sweater, hair tied back, listening more than she spoke. She held no clipboard. When someone asked for a volunteer to help organize the next event, she raised her hand. "I can help," she said softly. Her voice was calm. No arrogance, no authority, just willingness. The others smiled, welcoming her into the circle. And for the first time in a long time, Corinne Mitchell didn't feel powerful. She felt useful. Back at the ranch, Mark watched the sunset again, his horses grazing nearby. Nora arrived with new audit reports and placed them on his table. "All quiet this week," she said. "Most of the reformed HOAs are cooperating. Transparency's improving everywhere." Mark nodded, his gaze still on the horizon. "Good, let's keep it that way." As the sky deepened into gold and crimson, he thought of the woman who once tried to evict him, and how sometimes the fall of the proud wasn't punishment but correction. Because in the end, the lesson wasn't about power at all. It was about humility. And for those willing to learn, even the harshest reckoning could lead to redemption. The sun rose slowly over Willow Creek Ranch, stretching long golden fingers across the open pastures. The morning mist clung low to the grass, shimmering like silver threads. Birds stirred in the cottonwoods. A gentle wind carried the scent of rain that had fallen overnight, clean and new, as if the world itself had decided to start over. Mark Callan stood at the edge of the corral, leaning against the weathered fence post, sipping his coffee from a tin mug. His boots were still dusted from the previous day's work, and his shirt sleeves were rolled up, revealing the tan lines of a man who worked more than he spoke. The ranch was quiet now, peaceful, the kind of peace that comes not from absence of conflict, but from the settling of justice. He watched the horses graze lazily across the field. For the first time in months, there were no phone calls demanding his attention, no hearings, no crises, no corruption to chase down. The storm had passed and he had outlasted it. Just as he was about to head toward the barn, his phone buzzed in his pocket. The sound was sharp against the still morning. He pulled it out, expecting maybe a message from Nora or a report from one of the regional directors. But the screen displayed something else entirely, a direct message from the National Homeowners Association Board. The subject line read, "Reform Initiative, Director Callan, immediate acknowledgement required." Mark tapped the message open, and his eyes scanned the words carefully. "Director Callan, following your successful audit and exposure of the Willow Creek Division, the National Board has reviewed all regional HOA charters under your recommendations. Effective immediately, new guidelines for transparency, elections, and ethical oversight will be enacted nationwide. We wish to extend our gratitude. Your leadership has restored integrity to our organization. Sincerely, an HOA Executive Council." For a long moment he didn't move. He just stared at the screen, the quiet hum of the ranch wrapping around him. The words were simple, bureaucratic, even, but the meaning was monumental. It wasn't just about one corrupt board or one vindictive woman anymore. His actions had shifted the entire system. The very laws that once protected the petty tyrants like Corinne were being rewritten. And this time, the ink belonged to him. He slipped the phone back into his pocket and exhaled slowly. The sound of the wind through the trees seemed to whisper in rhythm with his thoughts. "Sometimes," he said softly, almost to himself, "you have to let them try to evict you to remind them who owns the deed." His voice carried faintly in the morning air, part wisdom, part warning. Later that day, Nora arrived in her truck, kicking up a thin cloud of dust as she pulled up beside the stables. She stepped out with a grin, holding a thick manila folder. "You've made headlines again, boss," she said, handing him the folder. Inside were newspaper clippings, online articles, and regional bulletins. Each headline seemed bolder than the last. "HOA Reform Sweeps Nation After NHOA Investigation." Director Mark Callan becomes face of homeowner justice. A new era for neighborhood freedom. He chuckled softly, flipping through them. "Never thought I'd see my name next to the word justice." Nora leaned against the truck, crossing her arms. "You earned it. You didn't just fix one board, you changed the whole system." Mark shrugged. "Systems change themselves when people remember why they exist. I just reminded them." Nora nodded. Still, not everyone could have pulled it off. You had the whole country watching. Mark smiled faintly, his eyes on the horizon. It was never about the country. It was about the people, the homeowners, the families who just want to live without fear of their own front yard. He looked back at her. That's who I work for. By noon, a small drone hovered over the ranch, snapping aerial photos for a feature story. Journalists had started calling Willow Creek the ranch that rebuilt the HOA. Mark didn't like the title, but he tolerated it, if only because it meant people were paying attention to the right things this time. Reporters sent endless interview requests, but he declined them all. He wasn't interested in fame or politics. He preferred the quiet, the honest kind that came from hard work and open skis. In his office, a simple wooden desk, a map of the country pinned to the wall, Mark laid out a new document. It was labeled the Callan Charter. It wasn't law yet, but it would be soon. Inside were the principles he'd learned through trial, resistance, and revelation. No HOA can override individual property rights. All financial records must be publicly accessible. Community boards must serve, not rule their residents. Leadership is earned through trust, not title. He signed it quietly at the bottom and slid it into a drawer. It wasn't a declaration of power, it was a promise. That evening, as twilight settled, Mark saddled his horse, Ember, and rode out across the ridge. The horizon was painted with streaks of orange and violet. The air smelled like sage and summer dust. From the high point overlooking his land, he could see everything: the fields, the ranch house, the fences that stretched like lines of history across the earth. Every piece of it had meaning. Every acre told a story. He thought of Corinne, of her fall, and of the thousands like her, small rulers of smaller kingdoms, who forgot the weight of the power they carried. But he also thought of the ones rebuilding now, the new leaders rising from the ashes of the old boards, the families reclaiming their freedom, the communities beginning to trust again. That was the real victory. Not the exposure, not the headlines, but the quiet revolution that started with a single defiant man and a ranch too sacred to be claimed by bureaucracy. He turned his horse toward home, the last light catching the badge still tucked in his jacket pocket, NHOA director, gleaming faintly like a symbol of both authority and restraint. He had been the enforcer, the reformer, and now, the guardian of something far greater than policy. He was the true governor, not of people but of principles, not of land but of integrity. And as the stars began to pierce the evening sky, Mark Callan rode on, the quiet architect of a new era, where every homeowner could stand tall again, knowing the deed to their dreams was finally, rightfully theirs. The morning of the celebration dawned bright and clear, the kind of golden morning that felt like a reward after a long storm. The air was soft with the scent of wildflowers and fresh hay, the sky so blue it almost didn't look real. Mark stood on the porch of his ranch house, watching trucks and wagons roll down the dusty road toward his gate. Word had spread fast through Willow Creek and beyond. Director Callan was hosting a gathering. Not a meeting, not an inspection, a celebration. One by one, neighbors began to arrive. Families who once whispered in fear of Corinne's clipboard now smiled openly as they passed under the wooden archway. Children ran barefoot across the grass, chasing dogs and laughter. Someone strung up ribbons between the fence posts. Another family brought a grill. It wasn't formal, it wasn't organized, and that was exactly the point. This was freedom, raw, messy, and beautiful. For the first time in years, the townsfolk were no longer afraid of fines, warnings, or violations. There were no HOA officials watching from the corners, no inspectors taking notes. There was only community, pure and unmonitored. Mark moved among them quietly, shaking hands, accepting warm hugs, laughing in a way that hadn't reached his eyes in years. "Mark," called out Tom Henderson, the farmer who used to get fined for his rooster crowing too early. "You see that barn of mine?" Mark turned to see it, freshly painted a bright, unapologetic red. The kind of color that once would have triggered a visual disruption citation under Corinne's rule. "Looks like freedom," Mark said, smiling. Tom laughed, clapping him on the shoulder. "Damn right it does." Nearby, a group of kids were painting a wooden sign that read, "Welcome to Willow Creek, the people's land." They'd used every color they could find, splattering bright streaks of yellow and blue across the rough boards. A year ago, that kind of creativity would have earned their parents a warning. Today, it earned applause. By noon, the smell of barbecue filled the air. Tables lined with homemade pies and casseroles stretched across the yard. Music played from an old radio someone had propped on a hay bale. Laughter rolled across the fields like music of its own. Nora approached, wiping her hands on her jeans. "You did it, boss, look around." Mark followed her gaze, children dancing in circles, old friends reunited, fences repainted in mismatched colors that somehow looked perfect together. "I didn't do this," he said quietly. "They did, I just took the weight off their shoulders." Nora grinned. "Still, you gave them the chance." He nodded. "That's all most people ever need, a chance to breathe on their own land." As the afternoon light turned amber, Mark called everyone together near the corral. He stood on the fence rail, the crowd gathering around him, the laughter fading into a respectful hush. "I just wanted to say something simple," he began, his voice calm but carrying. "When this place started, we built it on trust, neighbors helping neighbors. Somewhere along the way, that trust got replaced by control. People forgot that ownership means responsibility, not permission." He paused, letting his gaze travel across the faces of the townsfolk, people he'd known for years, people who had once been too afraid to even plant a tree without approval. "I didn't fight Corinne to prove I was right," he continued. "I did it to remind all of us what this land means. It doesn't belong to a board. It doesn't belong to a title. It belongs to the people who work it, live on it, and love it." A murmur of agreement spread through the crowd. He smiled faintly. "So today, no speeches, no politics, no rules, just freedom. Paint your barns, build your fences, live your lives. That's the way it was meant to be." The crowd broke into cheers. Someone started playing a fiddle. The sound of laughter rose again, louder this time not from relief but from joy. As evening fell, lanterns flickered to life across the property, their warm light glowing against the dusk. The ranch looked almost magical, a living symbol of what community used to mean before paperwork and power took over. Mark stood by the old oak tree where his father once taught him how to mend fences. He watched as families danced, neighbors shared stories, and children roasted marshmallows over the fire. Nora joined him again, holding 2 mugs of cider. She handed him one. "So, Director Callan, what's next for you?" He chuckled softly. "Next." He looked around the ranch, the laughter, the lights. "I think this is next. Sometimes the best way to lead is to just step back and let people live." Nora smiled. "You're really done with the spotlight, huh?" "I never wanted it," he said. "I just wanted peace." As the stars climbed higher, the last song of the night began, an old country tune that half the town knew by heart. Couples danced in the grass, their shadows moving gently under the lantern glow. Mark sat on the porch steps, sipping the last of his cider, his hat resting on his knee. Freedom didn't look like victory banners or polished medals. It looked like mismatched fences, kids laughing too loud, and people finally unafraid to live their lives. The HOA once ruled over them like a silent king, but tonight they ruled themselves. He smiled faintly as the breeze rustled through the grass. The ranch was alive again, not just his land but their land. The redemption wasn't just of property. It was of spirit. And for the first time in a long, long while, Willow Creek felt like home. The grand conference hall of the National Housing Oversight Authority buzzed with a low, electric energy. Rows upon rows of delegates, regional directors, policy analysts, and HOA presidents from every corner of the nation filled the seats. Cameras lined the walls. News outlets broadcasting the historic event lived to millions of homeowners watching from their living rooms. For decades, this annual summit had been a formality, a ceremony of polished words and empty promises. But this year was different. Everyone in the room knew why they were there. At the front of the hall, a broad banner stretched above the stage. An HOA Summit 2025, RESTORNG Trust in Homeownership. And beneath it, at the center podium, stood Director Mark Callan. The once reclusive rancher now looked every inch the leader he had always quietly been, composed, grounded, his weathered features softened by calm conviction rather than authority. He wore no suit, no silk tie. Just his clean button-down shirt, his old leather belt, and the same silver badge that bore his title. It was a statement in itself. That power didn't come from appearances, but from purpose. The murmurs quieted as the moderator introduced him. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our director and national chairman, Mr. Mark Callan, the man who reminded this country what fairness truly means. Applause erupted, thunderous and sincere. Some stood immediately. Others hesitated, as if they still couldn't believe the same man who had once lived on a quiet ranch was now reshaping the entire system that governed them all. Mark stepped to the podium. He waited for the applause to fade, his hands resting on the sides, his gaze steady. He didn't need notes. Every word was already carved into him, from years of seeing both sides of power, the abused and the abuser, the silent and the silenced. He took a slow breath. Homeowners associations, he began, his voice deep and clear, were meant to protect homes, not destroy them. The hall fell completely silent. They were founded on the idea of community stewardship, of neighbors working together to preserve what they built, not to dictate how others should live. But somewhere along the way, we forgot that purpose. Control replaced cooperation, fear replaced trust, and power replaced service. He paused, letting the weight of those words sink in. We've all seen it, the petty fines, the arbitrary rules, the misuse of authority. What began as governance turned into domination. And that, he said, his tone sharpening, ends today. A low murmur of approval rippled through the crowd. He continued, from this day forward we will operate under a new code, the Callan Charter. It is not just policy, it is a promise. He gestured to the massive screen behind him, where the 4 new principles appeared in bold text. Property rights are fundamental and non-negotiable. All board actions must be transparent and publicly recorded. Residents' voices hold equal weight to board authority. The purpose of governance is service, not control. Applause began to rise again, this time growing louder and more unified, echoing through the marble hall. Mark smiled faintly. This is not reform. This is restoration of fairness, of trust, and of the dignity that every homeowner deserves. He looked around the room at men and women who had once held unchecked power and at those who had suffered under it. Many nodded, their expressions thoughtful. Some looked humbled. And for the first time in the summit's history, the crowd wasn't divided by status or title. They were united by conscience. For too long, Mark continued, the rules were written by those who benefited most from them. But now the pen has changed hands. The power has returned where it belongs, to the people. The applause this time was explosive. Delegates rose to their feet, clapping, cheering, some even wiping tears. The cameras flashed like a storm. Mark didn't bask in it. He simply nodded once, as if confirming to himself that the moment was real. He closed with quiet strength. The era of petty control is over. The era of fairness begins today. When the summit adjourned, reporters crowded the stage, microphones thrust forward, questions shouted over one another, but Mark slipped out through a side corridor, his aide Nora trailing close behind. You could have stayed for the press, she said, half smiling. You just changed the entire nation's housing law. People want to hear from you. He chuckled softly. They've heard enough speeches. Now it's their turn to speak. Outside, the evening sun was setting over the Capitol, gilding the city skyline in amber light. Mark stopped for a moment on the marble steps, looking out at the wide expanse of the city, and beyond it, at the unseen millions who would soon live a little freer, sleep a little easier. He turned to Nora. It's not about me, he said. It's about every person who ever got told they couldn't build a fence, hang a flag, or plant a tree on land they owned. It's about giving that back. Nora nodded, quiet admiration in her eyes. So what now? Mark smiled faintly. Now I go home. That night, far away from the Capitol's polished halls, the flag of Silverstone Ranch fluttered gently in the open breeze. The moonlight caught its fabric deep green and silver, and beneath it, the ranch lay calm and proud. The same place that had once been threatened now stood as a symbol for something much greater. Justice restored, balance reclaimed, freedom reborn. Neighbors had begun calling it the birthplace of fairness. Mark stood by the porch rail, looking up at the waving flag. He could still hear faint echoes of applause from the summit playing through his phone, but he turned the volume down and listened instead to the rustling of the wind and the soft whinny of his horses. Out here, the world made sense. Out here, fairness wasn't a policy, it was a way of living. He took a slow sip of coffee and smiled to himself. Let them have their summit, he murmured. I've got my piece. As dawn approached, the first light touched the horizon, spilling gold across the fields. The flag of Silverstone Ranch rippled once more, not as a banner of authority, but as a quiet reminder that justice, once awakened, never truly sleeps again. And somewhere between the distant city and the humble ranch, the new rule of fairness began to take root, not in buildings or offices, but in hearts. The nation had found its balance again. And Mark Callan, the quiet rancher who wrote the rules, had finally come home.